as I watch TV and I see these ads for pharmaceuticals,
Yeah.
more than 50% of the ad usually is what can go wrong.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
I guess what I came away from your film is that how on earth were tasers able to be unregulated by seemingly anybody?
Yeah, it was the analogy, I'm glad you brought that up, because the analogy I use in the interviews that I do a lot is imagine a pharmaceutical company that not only doesn't have to tell you the side effects of the drug, but is willfully telling you that those very side effects don't exist. That's what they went through. And what it comes back to in terms of regulation is that because the weapon was not fired by gunpowder like the original ones were, it fell into the consumer space. The very terrifying thing to me about this weapon is that the electrical standards bodies don't understand how it works, so they refuse to test it. And so while deaths are rare, there's no way to test a safe threshold of electricity, because nobody knows, none of those standards bodies know how it works. And because they won't test it, it falls under the Consumer Product Safety Commission, like the guy says, just like a toaster might. And part of the willful sort of deceit was they knew that if everything was so rushed to market, that the first sign of weakness would threaten everything. And so in order to get out of that $2.5 million debt, they needed the turnover to start happening immediately. And so officers saw them work, which is why we start in the beginning with, watch these officers all think this is funny and watch it work, so they're all gonna buy it. If there was a sort of caveat of, oh, by the way, we haven't really done all the research yet, we don't know what the dangers are, the revenue would have been very slow. And so they had to start with that adamant safety claim that this could never kill anybody. And as it progressed and as it became clear that it could, they could never walk away from that, because the only thing that matters for them is their relationship with police. As soon as police distrust them, that's gonna be it, because it's not a magic bullet. It's not as safe as they would purport it. And any erosion of trust amongst law enforcement would seriously threaten the company's existence.
But there are some states that won't even, there are some states that won't even sell a TENS unit without a prescription.
Right.
So
Yeah.
what's
It was dumb luck. It was honestly, it was just one of those things that fell in this very strange niche space. And I think, and a lot of it, again, has to do with the electrical agencies that won't test it. But they took advantage of that sort of, black hole that they fell into. And by the time anybody realized how dangerous it might be, it was too late for them to turn back. It's sort of why we end the movie back at the beginning again, to see they make this one decision. And from that point on, there's no chance for redemption. The movie very much is structured all the things that threaten the company's existence. And so it's all, since they're the main characters, here are all the things that are conflict for them. And each time there's an opportunity to redeem themselves until that last phone call with police, where they very, willfully throw the police under the bus by suggesting it's all about litigation, it's not really dangerous. And then after that, it's like, well, geez, how did we get here? Well, once they made that first decision to choose themselves over anybody else, they were on that path and they were never coming back. Yeah, so it's a very long-winded answer to, they just got lucky,
When you were doing the research for this, I'm not sure how to phrase this. Did you look into suicide rates amongst tased people?
Oh, in terms of if it was sort of suicide by cop in a way? Oh, just
being tased.
Oh, sure. So the people that survived.
Yes.
Right, sure.
This is something that, hasn't been covered at all in the media. Occasionally they'll say this person died from the electric, et cetera. But as someone who was tased, and I, obviously survived, but I was suicidal for I don't know if I should say suicidal, but I went into a severe depression. I thought it was very strange because as I was getting ready to be discharged, they asked me, do you feel depressed? Do you feel suicidal? And I said, why would I feel that way? And I went home, and it was afterwards, after I had gotten home, that this depression and feelings of, wanting to commit suicide started. So, well, but I've never heard of that with anyone that, was arrested without being tased.
That's like good practice almost. You ask someone, are you suicidal? I'm a mental health person. That's just good practice.
I've been arrested, and I've had friends arrested, and no one that's not been tased has been asked if they're suicidal.
I think just from understanding training, officers training really well, just as part of, I got a broad overview of officer training, just kind of understanding it from the film. It's sort of, it would be used as a cop-out in a way, because the way that they like to then retroactively justify taserings is if they can make it sort of a mental disturbance, or if the person might have been, emotionally disturbed, whatever, it makes it easier to swallow post-incident for the public. And so that's probably pretty standard, just sort of cover your own ass sort of questioning when using a weapon like this, because it's easy to...
Someone that they're suicidal is covering your ass.
Right.
If you say, well, I asked them, and they told me no, and so what could I have done? If you didn't ask them, say, well, you didn't evaluate them, but it is covering your butt.
And I think we didn't look into it, we didn't look into it specifically, because I think from the very beginning of the film, when we start with the buffalo being tasered, it's not just a sort of demonstration of how powerful even that model that didn't work well could be. What we're saying is what happens when you give a person the technology that allows them to play God is that it dehumanizes them. And what the weapon did was it dehumanized officers to the people they protect, because they became enamored with standing at a distance and using this power to just control, right? And so I think what we're making a big statement about the idea of that technology and its quick embrace, only sort of the embrace of the best version of it, without thinking about all the things that might go wrong, because we're trying to, we don't think about hypotheticals until Stanley Harlan's dying in front of, police officers, or till someone is like yourself, it's being used on them in a situation that's probably inappropriate to subject somebody to that, because damn it, it's just so effective and it's just so fun, isn't it, right? And that's, that power is very dangerous. And as we've seen, and I'm sure Justin can, talk some about, because the NYCLU did a report several years ago that was very good, that desensitizes officers to the very act that they're doing, basically. But so I think that general point gets across, but I haven't looked specifically in terms of that sort of epidemiological review, because it would be incredibly difficult to pull off, considering the poor job we do in the United States of keeping track of use of force. But it's an interesting thought. I'm certainly curious about that, sure.
I'm curious, and I don't know how, I'm sure it would not be easy to research.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring this up, however, because of the nature of the weapon, the electricity. It does bring up questions as for neurological effects. And I also see from the movie that because of the way the police departments got their training, that there was a focus, I guess a focus from the lawyers and very much in the film as for cardiac arrest effects. But it does raise the question, I was wondering this as well watching the movie, if there are other effects such as seizures and strokes that have been connected with this as well.
Sure, they can be. The problem is that, again, it's a question of making an effort to keep track of the data. But I've certainly heard that. What I'm saying is I've heard that offhand from several people. Is there any is there any way definitively to suggest a pattern? No, but it would not be surprising at all, especially for younger people. A couple of people that approached me about that suggested that were teenagers. Their parents suggested they then had issues post-tasering as they were adolescent. But there's no, there's nothing concrete that I can point to or that we wanted to show as part of the film, only because, again, it's mostly the narrative trajectory is just like this company's trying to justify its own existence. But yeah, in terms of Taser issues, that would certainly be worth looking at. Did you want to?
I think there was one person ahead of me.
Well, sure.
I would rather not. He raised a point that is very valid to me, it's a subject that's close to me and my family. If a person is suffering from severe anxiety or a panic attack, like that gentleman in the airport could have been, after the not being able to speak the language, the 9 hours in waiting, the 9-hour flight. And if the police are faced with someone that is clinically depressed and on medication, I have MS, and I just went through a series of different EEGs. I had a 72-hour EEG. With 30 electrodes struck to my head, and that's mild, extremely mild bolts of electricity. But that was almost 2 weeks ago, and I still have burn marks.
Sure, yeah.
All over my head. I lost half my hair due to it. And if somebody is acting irrational, the police aren't. They're just assuming that they're high or drunk, or it just
Right.
behave. But that would be a typical reaction from someone that was already depressed,
Sure.
already suffering
Right.
from an anxiety disorder.
Right.
That would be normal behavior, especially if they're manic.
Yeah.
And to tase them, that could set off seizures. I know the EEG set off seizures on me. And again, that's mild extremes. And then what my other question was regarding their own training, where they had volunteer data. And the volunteers, they all seem to be shot with a taser. They all seem to be hitting the lower extremities, the legs, or
Yeah,
the
the
back.
training is done to shoot people in the back. It's not trained
So
in
how
the
did
chest.
the police just?
That's part of the disconnect, is most of the training they received was specifically designed to disarm them to the danger of the device, because the training is controlled from the top down. And so the company wants it to be as sort of non-threatening and funny, and like this experience they all share together where they all laugh about, because it takes the idea of it being a weapon out of their minds and gives them more of a perspective that it's sort of like it's a tool, is what they would say, right? It's a tool. And that's training is very specific, because if you take it seriously, you're going to use it more judiciously, and that's going to affect sales. In terms of people that are having mental problems or a mental health situation, I mean, in that incident, that's unfortunately, and Justin again probably can elaborate on this some, because that was part of NYCLU's research, but that it's disproportionately used on those kinds of situations, because their training suggests you use this safe weapon to control the situation first and then figure out what's wrong later. And of course, the danger of that is that it can spiral. It becomes, rather than being a tool of de-escalation, a tool of escalation, and then we can get in one of these tragic dances where somebody ends up being killed or, of course, seriously hurt. And they use this term excited delirium, which a cop told me the other day he'd never heard of until Taser came along. But that's their way of sort of justifying, hey, you got to get all the crazy people under control, and this is the best way to do it. And so it took away from de-escalation training and put it into, using force, which of course is incredibly misguided and dangerous. Did you want to elaborate on that, Justin?
Yeah, a little bit. First of all, I did want to introduce myself, but before I said that, I wanted to say thank you for making an excellent film. I'm a board member at the NYCLU, and I'm the chair of their legal committee. I was not, however, involved in the production of their Taser report many years ago because I just moved up to the area from New Orleans, where I was legal director of the ACLU of Louisiana. And down there, I actually litigated a Taser case against the New Orleans Police Department in which a lot of these issues came up. So my first question was, unfortunately, I stepped out of the room at the wrong time because while I was gone, somebody asked a question about how do you tase a guy who's in a sort of altered mental state, and what happens if you have a suicidal suspect. Could whoever, were you the one with that question? Or?
No, what I was saying was that after I got tased, I became severely depressed.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, no, you don't need to elaborate, but what happened, if I could just real briefly, what happened in my case was I had a client who was an Iraq war veteran, and he was in New Orleans, and he began going through an episode of acute PTSD. In the war, he was a 50 cal gunner on the roof of a Humvee on a convoy that used to go through IED infested areas, and he had been blown up a number of times. His Humvee had been overturned a few times, and he had a lot of concussive, bomb damage, head injury type things going on even before the incident in New Orleans. And so to seek help for his PTSD, he flagged down a New Orleans police officer, which is usually somebody's first mistake in New Orleans. He, at the time, was on the phone with his sergeant, who was 15 cities away, halfway across the country, but he was sort of the guy who all the platoon members called whenever they were in trouble. And so he's got a cell phone in one hand, and he flags down the cop with the other. And the cop gets out of the car, and he says, "Put the cell phone down." Now, my guy's got bomb damage in his right ear, and he's got his cell phone to his left ear, so he's not paying attention to the officer at all. The cop says, "Put the phone down." The guy refuses. "Put the phone down." The guy refuses. Cop pulls out a taser, says, "Hey, you, put the phone down." My client turns to face the cop, and the cop tases him full on in the chest. He falls over, hits his head on the sidewalk, and he fractures his skull, and now he's got a cognitive deficit. He can't smell, he can't hear, he can't taste anything, and he's got all kinds of other residual problems. We sued the city, and the end of the story is that we lost the lawsuit on qualified immunity, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but basically it's where the court says that, look, a reasonable officer under these circumstances would have done the same thing, and so we, even if there was a constitutional violation, we're not going to hold the officer responsible because it's too up in the air, it's too uncertain. And so they get this limited form of immunity in situations like that. But what the officer said was pretty interesting, and his behavior in that situation was sort of indicative of a lot of the stuff that you highlighted in your film, where the taser to him just became a weapon of first resort. And it was merely a device to induce compliance. And then, of course, after the fact, he made up all kinds of things about how my client pointed the cell phone at him, and he took that as a combative gesture. I think in his deposition, he even used the phrase combative stance, which I heard in your film. So that seems to be something that obviously they all get the memo about combative stances.
They learned that they learned combative stance on day one.
Threatening gesture, combative stance. So the officer's testimony was that the guy had pointed the cell phone at him and that he wasn't sure if it was a weapon or not, even though only 10 seconds earlier he had told him 3 times, put down the cell phone, put down the cell phone, put down the cell phone. He obviously knew it was a cell phone. He was just full of shit when he gave his deposition. But it worked, and he got the suit against him dismissed. But it was a lot of that stuff. Here's a guy with PTSD. He tells the officer, "I'm in distress. I've got PTSD. I'm an Iraq war veteran. I'm hoping that you're a war veteran too, so that we can, sit down and talk this out." No such luck. So I thought I would bring up the episode of the issue of mental illness in case anybody wanted to talk about that.
Well, it's exactly what you said, which is that they're trained now that because Here's the catch-22. Tasers, of course, were sold to the public as an alternative to deadly force, and they're very ineffective at high-risk scenarios. What didn't make the film, but the Warren Police Department talks about, is how they considered keeping them, but strictly writing their policies to only use tasers at the highest level just before they might use a gun.
Yeah.
And like real assaultive behavior. And what they found, though, because they actually kept pretty good data, was that 23% of the time, they didn't even get the intended effect they wanted. So now they were putting the officer in a dangerous scenario where a quarter of the time the weapon might not work. And it's, because the movie's not really a thesis about tasers itself, it was hard to work that in, but I found that fascinating because where it's most effective is at these lower levels of force because everything's more static and controlled. But of course, because it has all these serious risks to it, now you're talking about somebody like your client or somebody like Daryl Turner or somebody like Stanley Hart who ends up hurt or killed in a situation where it's impossible to justify using force. But the problem is that there's this disconnect about what the weapon is and how it's used, that policies that we as constituents allow our departments to write these very vague policies regarding its use so that then they can turn around and justify it because they want, as officers, all that latitude. And that's, I think, gets to the heart of the fact that the public still doesn't understand that these weapons are not the best version of the weapon. That's still common knowledge to people that, oh yeah, well, isn't it better than getting shot? And I'm like, you can't say anything more stupid than that if you're really understanding the issue. And that's where the film is made, is to basically speak to police officers to say, all right, I'm gonna assume the best about you, but here's what you need to know. If you're gonna act in good faith, they're hanging you out to dry. Because you can kill somebody with this thing or hurt somebody with this thing. And why the film is slightly more sympathetic than toward the police, especially the police we highlight, is because while they were naive, they're still the ones dealing with it on the ground. They're either paying out the litigation or they're dealing with the fact that they've killed or hurt someone. And the company has sort of insulated itself from all of that with these very surreptitious new warnings that I'm working on a new piece now. I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but I'm writing some long form pieces about tasers now. And one of them revolves around a police officer's son who was tasered and went into cardiac arrest 5 years after these warnings came out. And the training officer, as part of this lawsuit now, is saying, like, we had no idea still, this is 5 years after, that this is even a thing, that this is possible. And that goes to show how the loyalty they've created and the fierce sort of like cult following that they've created, and the tragedy of that is it doesn't get reversed until something goes wrong. And that's ass backwards, obviously, to me.
And it feels to me like a lot of that is because it really does, in those low stress situations like you talk about, make their jobs so much easier.
Right.
To just have a device that they can pull off their tool belt, point at somebody, pull the trigger, and 99% of the time not have any fatal or otherwise injurious side effects. And they don't have to think about it. Mm-hmm. There's no discretion that goes into taser use. Mm-hmm. It's just, let me pop this thing out and tase this guy. Mm-hmm. The Darrell Thomas or Thompson or Turner, the Darrell Turner case, I think the video of that was the most striking example of that I've ever seen.
Yeah, just
where the
walked
cop
in,
had it drawn as he was walking into the store, and he just walks up without even breaking stride and just zaps the kid in the back.
Right.
And it was, here's an easy end to this situation. Bang. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to use my training. I don't have to talk this kid down from anything. I don't have to negotiate with him. I don't have to pull my pistol and shoot him in the head for sure, which might be, certainly more dangerous, more traumatic for me, more traumatic obviously for the kid, and a completely unnecessary over-the-top use of force. But here's this thing that everyone has told me is relatively harmless. I can whip it out. I can zap a kid with it, end the situation, and be done. In the situation that I had down in New Orleans, if the officer had instead, it was obvious that my client didn't have a weapon. So if the officer had instead just called for backup and had 5 or 6 cops surround this guy for 10 minutes, he probably would have just hung up the phone and been like, okay, I'm ready to go. And so I think that's part of the problem. It's
Yeah.
used in these situations that might call for a little bit of discretion and that might call for a little bit of, creative policing. And it's just so much easier to just, pop, done.
Well, there's a bigger overarching issue of law enforcement right now, which is that most of the money they get to buy this kind of stuff, and one of my favorite parts of the screen's off, I'm pointing at black, but one of my favorite, as the director, moments in the movie is the last line from the police chief who's listing off all the things they have. And it's kind of like, oh, but you don't get, like I tried and now you still don't understand though, you're making this mistake about investing in technology to solve all problems or equipment. But a bigger part of that too is that most of that's free to them. It's bought through grant money. And so they don't set aside grant money for de-escalation training or for crisis intervention training or mental health training. What they set it aside for is like Kevlar vests and assault rifles and tasers and tanks. And in fact, it's a fascinating time in Europe right now because of what just happened in Paris, where like similar to what happened right after 9/11, all these municipalities, and there's more federal oversight of law enforcement in Europe, but they're doing this same dance where they're like, we need more shit to protect against, like all these threats that are out there.
And they get that at discounted rates from the Department of Defense. And then you wind up with sort of a syndrome where they bought all this shit, or they got it, they bought all this shit, or they got it for free, and now they own it and they have to use it.
Right.
Because otherwise, what did they buy it for?
Right.
And so there's this sort of either it's sunken costs fallacy or it's just this commitment to a product that they've embraced. And, we bought all these assault rifles, we bought this tank, we bought this APC, we bought all this body armor, so now we got to take out the TAC team and go serve arrest warrants with 15 guys in an assault vehicle.
Right.
But anyway, that's getting off.
Yeah, mine is not like a question, but the comment following the conversations. Like, I come from India, so it's like totally opposite. Like, the police use brutal force and there's no accountability for them. And then I went to Germany for my graduate studies. I lived there 7 years. I did not have any brush with the law, but Germans, they love their football. When there's a football game, even a local game, they get drunk and then they are totally disruptive. But the way I saw the police force handle them was amazing. They never once used the force. When there's a group of people that are disruptive, you would see the police surrounding them. They'll be standing there quietly. Yeah. Nothing bothers them. Nothing is personal to them. They are just standing there, not as though. The group people will shout at them, scream at them, and then they will start run. The police will run with them. They will stop. So they tease them like anything, which is very, very contrary to what I see here. It's like the police take everything so personal that you don't listen to my order, you don't follow me, you don't respect my authority, and then immediately use of force. Which kind of like, I think like, then there's something wrong with the training itself, the very basic concepts of policing, maybe here, that instead of protecting.
I'm so anxious to jump in because you said something that reminded me of something I wanted to say, which is that Rick Smith, the CEO, was just quoted in an International Business Times article that came out Monday that I was also, like it was a bigger piece about Taser International that I participated in. But one of his quotes early in the piece, as they're trying to expand into Europe, is talking about how difficult it is. While they're in a lot of those countries, I think it's like 1 in 20 officers use a taser or something like that in Europe. And it's like 2/3 of more than, I think it's actually 80% now of officers carry tasers in the United States. And his reasoning was, there's a hero's mentality about law enforcement in the United States. And he specifically said, and it's about where we expect the cops to go arrest the bad guys and take them to jail. And he said, and I don't think that's a bad thing, I think that's a good thing. But in Europe, it's much more about law enforcement serving the community and this like community-based law enforcement. And I just took a screen grab of this quote and like tweeted it out and was like, doesn't this explain everything about what we're talking about? That's so backwards from all the dumb slogans that are put on the side of a cop car, right? But we're getting this like, acknowledgement from a guy who's helped warp them through all this training that, you need to protect yourself, the public's dangerous, or isn't this better than beating them with your baton? But like, where's the option of not using any force? And that's striking to me that they're having this difficulty selling the weapon only simply because the departments are kind of like, well, but we don't use that much force. So like, why do we, why am I going to spend $1,300 on an electric weapon for all my officers when like, probably don't need them that much? And that's what they knew with American police. That's why they were so aggressive was American police, the weapons are so expensive that it would be very difficult to justify. I mean, these new ones are double the cost of a gun for them. So it would be very difficult to justify that expense if they couldn't use the weapons in all kinds of scenarios, not just the ones that make common sense. And because of that, we have what's commonly referred to, like the ACLU and Amnesty have called it usage creep, which I think is like a fair term. And that's, now we end up with like dead people who were, talking on their cell phone, like Stanley Harlan.
I think you've just answered one of the pressing questions I had at the end of this film, is that I was very surprised that the movie gave me the impression that 99% or more of these tasers have remained in the hands of the police force. So that if I had a different approach to conflict resolution, would I keep a taser in my glove compartment? Maybe because of the price, but I also wonder if Taser has been working to control the distribution, perhaps because of the litigation problems that would arise when I have that taser in my glove compartment.
Well, that's what they know. Now they've insulated themselves through all of this fine print warning stuff that it doesn't really matter anymore. And there are some fascinating cases happening now where they're litigating like wrongful death based on product liability post those warnings because the lawyers are saying like, these aren't real warnings. Let's call this out for what it is. But a lot of departments have either, like I said, gotten grant money to get them or bought them. And it's very difficult to go back now. And maybe they're not using them as frequently. And I think what's fascinating is if you really like examine certain cities, the usage is way up the first year they get them. People die or people get hurt, and then it goes way down. It's like Vancouver, like all of Vancouver, it went down. They still carry them, but it went down 87% after they killed not just him, but a couple other people as well. And so I think what's hard for them is they don't want to get rid of them altogether because it's an admission of, whoops, and yet the usage has definitely, in places where they've had strife, gone way down. And one more thing just about that real quickly too, it's one thing you should not buy into is the idea that suspect injuries go down. Officer injuries obviously go down because like they're just standing 15 feet away, but the correlation to how much force they're using goes up. The total amount of use of force goes up. The officer injuries go down. The suspect injuries they claim go down, but that's not really true. They go down only because of the way departments write or report injuries. They don't have to report the pain of the taser as an injury or the barbs that are left. They don't report those as injuries. So anytime you hit somebody with a baton, if it leaves a mark, they have to report it. And that makes it look like, oh, see, look at all the wonderful things it's done. And in reality, it's just not. It's like that how many lives saved thing. That's total bullshit. It's just, it's almost as close to a made-up number as they could have gotten. It was based off a very vague study that they did that suggested 5% of the time a taser is used, it's used at a high-level scenario, which that in and of itself is scary, that only 5% of the time it's used in an assaultive scenario. And then they just multiplied 5% by the total number of taserings in the world and go, we've saved 150,000 lives, and they're full of shit. But it works because it's really effective rhetoric. And that's what they're very great at. They're very great at controlling the message and using this rhetoric to push their product. So that's why the movie's about their warped minds. Yeah.
So I'm very impressed with your discipline at staying with the perspective. Did you find it personally painful to offer the movie.
Not burn it down to the ground.
Yeah, from the
Sure.
perspective of the company.
Yeah.
And what were your relationships like with the company? In other words, how did you get access to all that footage, and particularly all of the older archival footage?
The best thing that happened to me, well, first and foremost, sort of as like a filmmaker, I firmly believe in respecting humanity and never taking the simplest point of view or the narrowest point of view of anybody. So even if I think they're bad guys, why do I think that way? And trying to explore the idea of what it means to be a bad guy. Because like, I believe that the moral standards we set for ourselves are not really set internally, they're set based on the circumstances of the environment. And to me, it was a question of watching how they evolved from this altruistic thing that may or may not be true. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say they really did this with good intentions. You can see how we can justify about anything, you know, when we only see the best version of ourselves. And that's the perspective that I have in mind as a filmmaker, because that makes characters three-dimensional, you know. And especially in documentary, when people are real people. We're not one good thing, we're not one bad thing, we're a bunch of different contradictions, and that's fascinating to me. So I wanted to not just tear it all down, because that would have a limited sort of space. It would be kind of a movie made for the moment and made for the information. But by tearing, you know, by tearing through that and going deeper, it's now a movie about human psychology, corporate psychology, which is more universal, and could potentially have a broader impact and say more things about the way that, especially law enforcement who we trust, might interact with a private company, or, well, a publicly traded company, but, you know, one company. So I think that discipline was never setting out in the first place to feel like I wanted to prove anything about them. I wanted to explore what they were thinking more than what they were doing in a way, if that's not too directory of me to say. And because of that, I understood them better. I don't empathize with them. I think that's the wrong word to use. I understand them. And the movie is made as a reckoning, as to say, look at yourselves in the mirror and see if you can just come back to reality for 10 seconds, because you're just out there living the American dream and protecting truth and protecting life, and like you can't see what's right in front of your face. And that's very human. That's not just a bad guy thing, that's a human thing. But it was difficult because I'm very close to Stanley Harlan's family, and the whole movie began with his case. And I started with his case, and it was initially a movie about Moberly, Missouri and the cops and what had gone wrong there. And as I got into more of their training, I started to know a little bit more about the company. But when I went to Taser, I didn't know, I knew 10% of the things I know today. It was that Orwellian nature of Taser and this place and this projection of this image that made me go, okay, this is weird. This is definitely weird and worth exploring further. And that helped, because it's not like I was sitting on this big, like, well, you did a study that you didn't say anything about it. It wasn't even like I was sitting on any of that at the time anyway. So it was really easy to just go there and be like, explain your, like, tell me about yourself. So, I don't know, I guess.
And so they took that at face value?
Yeah,
and they provided all of that?
Well, in terms of the specific footage, they provided some of it, but a lot of it also came from those lawyers, because they get, through the discovery process, they get access to all of this wealth of material. So I was able to get some footage from them, and the deposition footage especially from them. But Taser, I didn't manipulate Taser to get in that space. I said to them, I'm genuinely curious about the way you see yourselves and the way your point of view of the world. Because I went in thinking, like, I've got this weird case where it seems like your safe weapon actually did kill somebody, just curious to hear your thoughts on that. And when they were like so batshit about how it could never happen, I went, oh, okay, this is, there's something more going on here. And that's why I feel good about it. I mean, I don't feel like I manipulated them at all. That is how they see themselves, so.
We're just going to take a couple more questions, but thanks.
an expansion of my earlier comments. I would have thought that the reviewer from the Cleveland Clinic that was hired would have made some analogy to a defibrillator, and it would.
Sure.
Do you happen to know whether a defibrillator is less electricity or more electricity for a shorter shot, or what the issues are that would not make what's going on anything that one would call an analogy?
It's more electricity, but it's specific. It's like a pacemaker that is intentionally used, obviously, to do one specific thing. And what happens, like why a defibrillator might have saved Stanley Harlan's life, is because in fibrillation, that defibrillator, that's its only intended purpose, is to use the electricity specifically to shock it back to normal sinus rhythm. So it's more powerful in that way. Like you should never use a defibrillator on a normal person, right? But basically, what's going on is also a little bit more complicated with the taser, because it's not a direct fibrillation. It's very rare. Like the Warren kid was one of the very few kids who it shot him and it started fibrillating right away. Most of the time it's when they hold the trigger down, it's capturing the normal rhythm, and then as it's continuing to be held down, the heartbeat, instead of matching its own normal sinus rhythm, is trying to match the taser pulse, and it escalates to fibrillation. And that's a more, I think that's why it's so important that they are aware of the dangers of prolonged tasering. Because if you do capture somebody's heart, which I think happens way more in the field than people realize, and their hearts just go back into normal sinus rhythm on their own. If you continue to, once you've captured their heart, hold the trigger down, the chances of it going into fibrillation obviously start to increase exponentially.
I don't know if I missed something in the movie, but a little while ago you said that the tasers are not useful in more dangerous situations. Right. And I've never really gotten that sense, and I don't really understand why you would say that. So I'm curious as to what you mean.
There's a lot of user error. And in fact, specifically why the new models have 2 shots is because a lot of officers, let's start from just the point that if it's 1 shot and they're reliant on that, they can miss very easily. It's an electrical weapon, so it can misfire. In fact, a lot of the earlier models, this X26 model, why they become so expensive is because they're super advanced now. Especially the earlier models are just not, I don't think they're well-made products, so they misfire a lot on their own. In fact, the officer, that Greg Booten, who's the guy who starts off by explaining, my first guy I tasered, it worked like a charm. That's an excerpt from a series of stories he tells about from the first time he used it, the second time he used it, to the third time he used it. And he only ever used it 3 times in the field. And he said the third time, I pulled it out and I tried to shoot somebody with it and it just jammed and it stuck and it stuck. And it was a guy who was coming after him to get in a fist fight, to really mix it up. And he had to chuck it on the ground and wrestle with the guy because it just misfired, it blanked. And so as an electrical weapon, it's just not that can happen.
So why wasn't that part in the movie? Because that would have, to me, I didn't, as a viewer, I'm watching this movie and I'm saying, okay, but as if I'm a law enforcement person, or if I'm a conservative, person, I think everyone here tends to be more on the same kind of somewhat liberal page, we might say. But if I'm a more conservative person, I'm going to view this movie and say, well, duh, everything has problems, but we still need it. You're not going to see, well, there's really a lot of, it's more than just, sometimes we have accidents.
Well, what's important to remember about me, again, is that I wanted to make a film, and I didn't want to make an argument about how to use force for police officers. Not to say you're wrong, but specifically having already talked to police officers, a lot of them who've seen the movie, they respond really well to the movie because they're specifically more aware of user error to begin with anyway, but also they feel like the movie's thoughtful about their point of view as well. And so since it doesn't put them on their heels, it allows them to engage more thoughtfully with what the company is saying, because the only way that it's ever going to get better is if just cops make better decisions in the field. And the only way they're going to do that is if they see these guys for who they really are and not these heroes, basically. So that was my, like, if you want to say if I had like an activist streak, that was it, that tunnel vision of speak to police officers because they're going to make the decision in the field. And then, you know, I didn't want to get hung up too much on like building a case that tasers don't make sense or aren't effective or don't work. I think you get, for the most part, from the potential for it to be misused as we kind of like build that case in. It's like a clear trajectory. This thing seemed to be really effective. It's in fact so effective that they use it on 6-year-old kids and 88-year-old grandmothers. Oh, in fact, it's dangerous and it might kill somebody, so they're using it at this low level of force and now somebody's dead. That's like if you want to really simplify the taser trajectory, that's the 1, 2, 3 that we do in the film, but I didn't want to divert and go off too much on tangents about all the things that are wrong potentially with the weapon, strictly because it's a movie about this company. And it's a movie about this company because I made it for law enforcement. Because law enforcement ultimately, like they're not giving these things back, you know? It's not like we're gonna rally the troops and all of a sudden get 500,000 tasers off the street, because that in and of itself, they're so reliant on that training now, that would bring its own consequences. You can't overnight change the way that cops do their jobs. This is the consequence of that. Overnight, they changed the way cops did their jobs, and a lot of people died and were seriously hurt. So I had that more sort of like nuanced approach of, if there's what are the limited things you can accomplish in a 90-minute film, and not necessarily a 100-page research paper you might be able to write.
Okay, I thank you for your incredibly generous comments and responses, and for this amazing film, which I think is really, as you said earlier, nuanced and sophisticated and all about pointing out this corporate greed and everything. So thanks so much for coming here.
Thank you guys.
Thank you all, too. That was a
Thanks.
great conversation.